Not everything that weighs heavy is gold, and not every inheritance is measured in money. At exactly 3 a.m, I saw my son robbing me. He was carrying a chest, 27 million in jewelry and gold. I watched him from the darkness. He was sweating, breathing hard, and dragging it out of my house like thieves. And I did nothing. I did not scream. I did not stop him. I did not call the police, but when he opened the chest he was shocked. Because he didn't know what I had done. Before I tell you what was in the chest, like this video, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are listening to my story from. I want to know how far it has reached. My name is Harold Whitmore, and I am 81 years old. I live on an old estate at the edge of Vermont, in a house passed down through generations. It smells of aged wood, cedar polish, and the candles my wife used to light each night. It has been 22 years since she passed, and only 3 weeks since I discovered the emptiness where everything I valued once rested. Not the gold or the jewelry, but the trust one believed would never break. When I walked into the back room and saw the vacant spot where the chest had always been, I didn't call out or reach for help. I simply stood there, hands trembling, staring at the dust on the stone floor. A perfect rectangular outline remained, sharp like a scar carved into the house, and I felt a bitter smile forming because I already knew who had done it. The chest weighed nearly 350 pounds. Inside were the jewels my grandfather crafted by hand, the gold bars my father collected over 5 decades, and the heirlooms passed through forgotten weddings and distant wars. Everything together was valued at $27.5 million, but to me it was never about wealth. It was the legacy of 3 honest generations who never stole or deceived. Yet that night, my only son dragged it away as if it were worthless, as if I were too old to notice anything. I sat on the cold floor of that room, leaning against the wall, staring at the hollow space while the chills seeped into my bones. I stayed there until the first light of morning. Outside, the roosters crowed like they always had, but to me the sound felt heavier, almost mournful, as if even they sensed what had happened. Marjorie, my housekeeper, arrived at 6 just like she had for 32 years. She had practically raised my son when my wife fell ill, feeding him, cleaning after him, waiting at the door when he returned from school. That morning she walked into the kitchen, set the water to boil, and found me in the living room wearing yesterday's dusty clothes. She looked at me only once and understood everything without a word exchanged. She stepped closer with the gentle caution one uses with someone in pain, rested her warm, aging hand on my shoulder, and whispered, "He took it, didn't he?" I nodded because I couldn't speak. She closed her eyes, and I watched her face collapse into grief. She wept for me, for the boy she had raised, and for the legacy that had vanished. I let her cry, because the tears she shed were the ones I no longer had the strength to release. My son's name is Daniel Whitmore. He is 48 and lives in a New York apartment that costs more than anything I ever earned. He calls himself a businessman. He walks in tailored suits, wears a Swiss watch, and carries the scent of polished lies. But I know him better than anyone. I know how his shoulders shift when he's nervous, how his eyes drift when he lies, how his jaw tightens when he's plotting. For 6 months he visited me often, yet every time his gaze drifted toward the back room. He always created excuses to pass through it. "Dad, let me help you organize. Dad, this place needs updating." But he wasn't visiting me. He was calculating. 3 months ago, he brought a man named Colin Sharp, a tall fellow in a gray suit with a hollow smile and soft hands untouched by real work. He claimed to be a financial advisor offering to protect my assets. He spoke quickly, with forced confidence and empty jargon that meant nothing. "Mr. Whitmore, keeping a fortune like this in an unprotected house is extremely risky." I looked at him, then at my son, and calmly said, "I've kept it safe for 60 years. Nothing has ever happened." Colin smiled without warmth, and Daniel gave a patient grin, the kind wolves wear when waiting for the right moment to strike. My wife's name was Eleanor. She died in 2003 after months sitting in the same wicker chair that still rests near the window. She loved watching the roses in the garden, saying they reminded her life continued even when the body failed. Shortly before she passed, she held my hand with her cold fingers and looked into my eyes. "Harold, don't give everything to Daniel. Make sure he earns it first." I didn't understand then. Why would you say that? She pressed my hand with what little strength she had left and whispered, "Promise me." And I did. But after she died, he was all I had left, and I tried to trust him. I tried to believe he was the man I hoped he would be. But Eleanor had seen the truth long before I did. She always did. On the night of the theft, Daniel arrived with his wife, Lucia. They showed up late, close to 11 at night, claiming they were on their way to the coast and had stopped by to say hello. It was an obvious lie. The coast was in the opposite direction, but I stayed silent. We had dinner together. Marjorie had made lamb, Daniel's favorite when he was young, yet he barely touched it. Lucia hardly looked at me, polite but cold, like a beautiful statue with nothing behind the eyes. Daniel talked about business, travel, and some important contract in Boston, things that meant nothing to me anymore. I just wanted him to linger long enough to ask how I was, to say something real, something from before. But he didn't. When midnight came, they left. He hugged me briefly at the door, said, "Get some rest, Dad," and I believed him. I went to sleep thinking there was still a piece of my son somewhere inside him. How foolish that was. I woke at 3 in the morning. Age makes sleep light, and at first I couldn't tell why I had opened my eyes. Then I heard it, a scraping noise, a slow dragging sound across the wooden floor. Then a soft thud. Another one. My heart raced, not from fear, but from the awful confirmation of what I already suspected. I walked into the hallway barefoot. The old boards creaked under my feet, but they were too busy to hear me. The door to the back room was slightly open. A yellow beam of light moved inside, coming from a flashlight, and I recognized the silhouette instantly. The broad shoulders, the posture, the way the hands moved. Daniel was there, holding the flashlight, and behind him stood Colin, helping him lift the chest. They carried it together, slow and silent like practiced thieves. I watched from behind the wall, hidden in the dark, as my own son robbed me. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just watched them grunt from the effort, coordinate without speaking, and move with the confidence of men who had rehearsed this. They passed less than 10 feet from me. I smelled Daniel's expensive cologne, and something in me died at that moment. Not love, because that had already broken years ago, but hope. The final hope that I had misjudged him. That maybe I was wrong. But I wasn't. There he was, taking what he believed was my fortune and carrying it out of the home he grew up in. They slipped out the back door. I heard a van engine, the metallic scrape of the ramp, the heavy thud as they pushed the chest inside. Ropes tightening, doors slamming. Then the engine fading into the distance until the night fell silent again. I stood alone in the dark living room with cold hands and a slow, heavy heartbeat. I thought, he really did it. But I didn't cry. Something inside had already snapped. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was the realization that the son I believed I had never truly existed. He had been a mirage I held onto for 48 years. The next morning, Marjorie arrived early. She found me in the kitchen holding a cold cup of coffee, wearing the same clothes, my eyes dry and hollow. She looked at me once and knew. "Mr. Whitmore," she whispered. I lifted my hand to stop her. "I know, Marjorie. I know." My voice sounded distant, as if it came from someone else. She sat across from me with red eyes. I knew she had cried before coming. "Are you going to call the police?" she asked. I slowly shook my head. "Not yet." She frowned. "Why not?" I met her gaze. "Because first, I want him to see what he actually took. I want him to open that chest. I want him to understand who I am." She didn't understand. I hadn't told her anything yet. I had no real plan at the time, just anger, justice, and a decision as cold as steel forming inside me. That afternoon, with the sun sinking behind the hills, I called Elijah Ford, my friend of more than 50 years. We learned the craft together, built our lives side by side, and buried our families in the same soil. I told him everything, every detail, and he stayed quiet for so long I thought the line had dropped. Then he exhaled and said, "Harold, I warned you. I told you he wasn't the same anymore." "I know, Elijah," I said. There was another stretch of silence, just his breathing on the other end. Then he asked, "What are you going to do?" I closed my eyes and felt a calm I didn't recognize. Sharp, cold, final. "I'm going to teach him a lesson he'll never forget, even if it costs me what little family I still have." Elijah didn't reply, but he didn't need to. He understood. He is a father too. And he also knows where to strike. Daniel was born on February 14, 1977, on a snowy Vermont morning, something unusual for that time of year. Eleanor said it was a sign. "This boy is going to be special," she whispered while holding him for the first time. I looked at him, tiny enough to fit in both my hands, eyes closed, skin flushed, black hair stuck to his head. When I touched his cheek, he opened his eyes and looked at me, and I felt something deeper than love. It was responsibility, a promise, the certainty that he would grow into everything I could never be. I held him close and whispered, "I'll take care of you. Always." His early years were beautiful. Daniel learned fast, walking before he turned 1, speaking full sentences before 2. He was curious, always asking questions, always wanting to know the why of everything. He spent afternoons with me in the workshop. I sat at my wooden table with my loop and tweezers, shaping jewels, while he perched on a little stool beside me watching as if witnessing magic. When he was 5, he asked, "Dad, why does gold shine?" I stopped working and told him, "Because it's pure sun. Because it has nothing false inside." He smiled, and I believed he understood. By 8, he helped me clean the tools. I showed him how to polish them, how to arrange everything properly, how to respect each piece as if it carried a soul. "This isn't just gold, Daniel. This is history. This is family." He nodded as if the weight of those words made sense to him. One Saturday, he ran into the workshop with a drawing of a ring, simple and childish, but full of little details that surprised me. "Dad, when I grow up, I'm going to make rings like you." I knelt down, placed my hands on his shoulders, and told him, "You'll be better than me, son. Much better." He hugged me, and I closed my eyes, feeling his heartbeat against mine. That day, I thought I had done everything right. But everything changed when Eleanor fell ill. Daniel was 12. At first it was fatigue, then pain, then the tests, the appointments, the words we feared. Cancer, advanced, untreatable. Daniel grew quiet, withdrawn. He spent hours locked in his room. I tried talking to him, but he only said, "I'm fine, Dad. Just leave me alone." And I did, because I didn't know how to help him while I was barely holding myself together. 3 years later, Eleanor died. Her funeral was a gray, airless day. Daniel didn't cry. He stood before her coffin with his hands in his pockets, staring at the ground. When it ended, he walked away without saying a word. At 18, he moved to New York to study business administration. I wanted him to stay, learn the craft, continue our tradition, but he said, "Dad, that's the past. No one works with their hands now. The future is different." I had no answer. I just watched him pack, watched him board the bus, watched him give me a quick hug without meeting my eyes, and when the bus pulled away, I felt something inside me sink. I wasn't just losing a son who was leaving home. I was losing the boy who once called me a hero. For the first few years, Daniel called every week. He talked about his classes and the city. I asked if he was eating well, sleeping enough, needed money. He always said, "I'm fine, Dad. Don't worry." But his voice changed. It grew sharper, colder, as if he was becoming someone I didn't recognize. At 23, he told me he had a girlfriend named Lucia. "She's smart, Dad. You'll like her." Lucia was tall, thin, with straight blonde hair, expensive clothes, and manners polished to perfection. She greeted me with a smile that never touched her eyes. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Whitmore." Her handshake was soft, cold, and empty. During dinner, she talked non-stop about business, investments, and opportunities. Daniel stared at her with admiration. I stared at them both and wondered where my son had gone. After the meal, I stepped into the garden to smoke a cigar. Marjorie followed quietly. "Mr. Whitmore, That girl isn't good for him. I sighed. I know, Marjorie, but he's an adult now. He doesn't listen to me anymore. She shook her head gently. No, sir. You're his father. You still have to try. But I didn't, because fear held me back. Fear of pushing him farther away, fear of losing what little bond remained. Daniel married Lucia 2 years later. The wedding was in a luxurious New York hotel full of people I had never met. I sat alone in the first row, watching my son say, "I do," with a smile that looked rehearsed. I watched Lucia look at him with eyes that reflected ambition, not love. When it ended, he hugged me briefly. "Thanks for coming, Dad." I hugged him back and said, "Take care of her. And take care of yourself, too." But he wasn't really listening anymore. The years rolled on. Daniel visited less and less, once a year at most, always in a rush, always with excuses. "Dad, I have too much work. Dad, I have to travel." I told myself I understood, but the truth was harsher. It hurt. It hurt waiting in that large, silent house for a call that never came. It hurt seeing those old photos of him as a boy, laughing, bright-eyed, full of life, and comparing them to the man he had become. One afternoon, Elijah stopped by. He found me staring at one of those pictures. "What are you looking at, Harold?" he asked. I let out a long breath. "My son, before he lost himself." Elijah rested a hand on my shoulder. "There's still time. As long as you're alive, there's time." 2 years ago, Daniel began visiting more often. At first, I thought something inside him had shifted, that perhaps he wanted to rebuild what we once had. But I soon noticed a pattern. He asked about the chest constantly. "Dad, you still keep it back there? Dad, when did you last check it? Dad, shouldn't you move it to a bank?" I tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but he always returned to it. And every time he left, that uneasy weight grew heavier. I realized he wasn't coming to see me. He was circling something else. The only person who sensed it was Iris, my granddaughter. She's 23, studying art history in Boston, and she's the one who inherited Eleanor's gentleness. The same green eyes, the same tender smile, the same enormous heart. One day she sat with me in the garden, teacup in hand, and asked softly, "Grandpa, do you trust my dad?" I was taken aback. "Why would you ask that?" She lowered her eyes. "Because I don't. I haven't for a long time." A chill ran through me. "Iris," she cut me off. "I know when he lies. And lately, he lies all the time." I said nothing, because she was right, and because pretending otherwise had become impossible. 2 months before Daniel brought Colin to the house, I turned 80. 80. A number that settles on your shoulders and makes you feel the weight of time. Eleanor always said, "Birthdays are for being with the people you love." And all I wanted that day was for my son to come. No gifts, no party, just him. A week before, I called him. "Daniel, I turn 80 on Saturday. Can you come?" There was a pause. "Dad, let me check my schedule. I'll confirm." He never did. Not that day, not the next, not the next. Still, I waited, because a father always waits. The Friday before my birthday, I called again. "Daniel, are you coming tomorrow?" He sighed, irritated. "Dad, I've got an important meeting. I don't know if I can." My voice trembled. "Son, you only turn 80 once." Another long silence. "I know, Dad. Let me see what I can do. I'll call you later." He hung up. He didn't call. That night, I sat in the kitchen until late. Marjorie noticed. "Mr. Whitmore, are you all right?" I forced a smile. "Yes, Marjorie. Just tired." It was a lie. I wasn't tired. I was breaking because I knew the next day would come, and no one would walk through that door. Saturday arrived sunny and bright. I woke early, showered, and put on the shirt Eleanor always said made me look handsome. When I went downstairs, Marjorie was already there with a small homemade cake. "Happy birthday, Mr. Whitmore." I hugged her. "Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you for remembering." She blinked away tears. "How could I forget?" We placed the cake on the table but didn't cut it. I was still waiting for the phone to ring, for Daniel to say, "Dad, I'm coming." Hours passed. 9, 10, 11. Nothing. At noon, Marjorie set the table with the good plates and the silverware we used when Eleanor was alive. "Just in case he comes," she whispered. I nodded. We sat in silence. Daniel's chair was empty. Eleanor's chair was empty. And staring at those two vacant seats, I felt something new. Not sadness. Loneliness. A sharp, physical ache, like a hand squeezing my chest. Marjorie watched me helplessly. Words can't fill empty chairs. At 3 in the afternoon, the phone finally rang. I rushed to it like a much younger man. "Daniel." But it was Iris. "Grandpa, happy birthday. I'm sorry I couldn't come. I have exams." I smiled softly. "Thank you, sweetheart. Don't worry." She hesitated. "Grandpa, is my dad there with you?" I looked at the untouched plates. "No, sweetheart. He didn't come." Silence hung heavy over the line. Did he at least call? I closed my eyes. "No," Iris exhaled, angry and hurt. "I can't believe him. Grandpa, I'm so sorry." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm fine." Another lie. But a grandfather doesn't hand his pain to a young heart. Later, I walked out to the garden and sat on the stone bench where Eleanor used to admire the roses. The sun dipped low, birds sang, a soft breeze moved through the leaves. Everything was peaceful except me. I looked at my phone. No messages. No missed calls. Nothing. My son had forgotten my birthday. Or worse, he hadn't forgotten at all. He simply didn't care. And that second possibility cut deeper, because forgetting is human, but ignoring is a choice. And Daniel chose to ignore me on the day I turned 80. On a day that could very well have been one of my last. At 7 that evening, Marjorie brought the cake with a single candle. "Mr. Whitmore, you need to blow it out and make a wish." I looked at her and asked, "And what am I supposed to wish for, Marjorie?" She sat down beside me. "Whatever your heart wants." I stared at the flame flickering gently in the draft and thought about what I truly wanted. I thought of Eleanor, wishing she were still alive. I thought of Daniel, wishing he were still the boy he used to be. But when I finally looked inward, I realized the only thing I wanted was to stop hurting, to stop waiting for something that would never come. I blew out the candle, and the wish I made was the saddest of my life. May I find the strength to accept that my son no longer loves me. That night at 11, after I had already given up hope, the phone rang. It was Daniel. "Dad, happy birthday. Sorry for calling so late. I had a terrible day. Meetings non-stop." His voice sounded tired, but not regretful. I stayed silent. "Dad, are you there?" I took a deep breath. "Yes, Daniel. I'm here. I've been here all day. Waiting for you." He hesitated. "Dad, I told you I had meetings." For the first time in years, I didn't swallow my feelings. "Daniel, today I turned 80. 80. And you didn't come. You didn't even call on time." I sat here alone, looking at the door, hoping it would open. He sighed, annoyed. "Dad, don't exaggerate. It's just a birthday." And in that single sentence, everything became clear. "It's just a birthday," I repeated slowly. "You're right, son. It's just a birthday. Just like I'm just your father. Just like it was only your mother who raised you. Just like this is only the house where you grew up." My voice trembled, but it wasn't weakness. It was rage held in place by years of silence. "Daniel, your mother died 22 years ago. Since then, you've been the only thing I had left. The only thing. And today, when I turned 80, you didn't come. Not because you couldn't, but because you didn't want to. He tried to interrupt. Dad. But I kept going. And the worst part isn't that you didn't come. The worst part is that you didn't care. That to you, I'm just a birthday. Something forgettable. Something not worth the effort. I hung up. And then I broke. I cried harder than I had in years. Marjorie, who had heard everything from the kitchen, came over and wrapped her arms around me. She didn't speak. She just held me while my chest shook. And in her embrace, I understood something terrible. He was a stranger who happened to share my last name. A man who called me Dad, but didn't know what that word meant. That night, on my 80th birthday, something inside me died. It wasn't love, that had been fading for years. It was hope. The last fragile hope that someday he might return to the boy he once was. The boy who hugged me in the workshop, who called me his hero, who drew pictures of us under a bright yellow sun. That boy was gone. And in his place stood a man who forgot birthdays, ignored his father, and only appeared when he wanted something. The next day, a package arrived. It was from Daniel, a large box containing an expensive, gleaming watch and a card. Happy birthday, Dad. Sorry I couldn't come. Here's something so you remember me. I looked at the watch, cold and soulless, probably bought quickly in an airport shop to ease his conscience. I placed it in a drawer. I didn't need a watch to remember him. I needed a son, and that, no matter how much money he spent, he could never buy. That afternoon, Elijah visited me with a bottle of old wine. Happy belated birthday, Harold, he said. We sat in the garden, and I told him everything. When I finished, he shook his head. That boy is lost. I nodded. I can't save him anymore, Elijah. I can't. After that forgotten birthday, after talking with Iris, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. They're just suspicions, I told myself. He hasn't actually done anything wrong. But the following weeks proved me wrong. Daniel began calling more often, sometimes 3 times a week, but the calls were cold, clipped, transactional. How are you, Dad? And before I could answer fully, he was already shifting the conversation. Hey, did you think about that insurance I mentioned? When I sighed, he grew irritated. You don't understand. Keeping things like that in a house these days is insane. And he'd hang up without even saying goodbye, leaving me with a deadline and a hollow feeling in my chest. One afternoon in October, he appeared unexpectedly with a folder under his arm. Dad, I brought information. Look at this. Inside were brochures for security firms, banks, armored storage units, all stamped with Colin Sharp's company logo. I glanced through them without interest. Daniel, I don't need this. He slapped his hand on the table. Not hard, but enough for Marjorie to peek her head from the kitchen. You're being stubborn, he snapped. What if someone robs you? If something happens to you, that chest needs to be protected. I stared straight at him. Protected from whom, Daniel? He froze. His face drained of color. Then, quieter, he murmured, From anyone, Dad. From anyone. But what wounded me the most wasn't the brochures or the arguments. It was when he stopped calling me Dad in person and began saying old man. The first time it happened, we were in the garden. I offered him a glass of water. No, old man. I already drank. I froze. I thought I had misheard him. What did you say? He didn't even blink. What? I didn't push it, but that word lodged in me like a splinter. The second time was worse. We were arguing again about the chest, and he raised his voice. Old man, understand this once and for all. You're not fit to handle those things anymore. I stood from my chair and looked him straight in the eyes. Don't call me that again. He let out a dry, empty laugh. Old man is what you are, Dad. Old and stubborn. That night, I didn't eat. I sat in the dark living room with my hands resting on my knees, staring at the wall. Marjorie came in slowly with a bowl of soup. Mr. Whitmore, you need to eat something. I shook my head. She placed the bowl on the table and sat beside me. That boy isn't the same anymore. I nodded. I know. She laid her wrinkled hand over mine. You don't have to accept this. He may be your son, but you still deserve respect. My throat tightened. And what do I do, Marjorie? Let him go forever. She sighed. Maybe you already have. And maybe now you need to look after yourself. A few days later, she told me something that chilled my blood. Mr. Whitmore, forgive me for saying this, but I need to tell you. I looked at her. Go on. She lowered her voice. That man, Colin, the one who came with your son. I saw him again. He was outside the house alone. I went out to sweep the front, and there he was across the street, looking at his phone. When he noticed me, he walked quickly to a car. But before leaving, he passed near the back door. He crouched down, and he was studying the lock. I felt my breath catch. When was this? She lowered her eyes. 4 days ago. I didn't want to frighten you, but I had to tell you. That afternoon, I checked every door, every window, every bolt. Everything was intact, but I no longer felt safe. I felt watched, studied, as if someone were mapping my house and memorizing my habits. I called Elijah. Harold, you need to act, he said. You can't sit there waiting for disaster. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept that my own son, my blood, was preparing to rob me. But all the signs were there, and denial could no longer protect me. One Sunday, Iris visited again. This time she brought lunch. We ate in the garden. She kept glancing at me with worry. Grandpa, you look exhausted. I forced a smile. I'm fine, sweetheart. She set her fork down. No, you're not. I know you. She leaned closer. Is it my dad again? I didn't answer. And that silence was enough. She closed her eyes. Please tell me what's happening. So I told her everything. The stalking, the calls, the old man comments, the strange behavior around the locks. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, her eyes were full of tears. I can't believe he'd do this to you, she whispered. I squeezed her hand gently. I don't want to believe it either, but the evidence is there. She stayed quiet for a long time, then looked up with resolve. Grandpa, I'm going to talk to him. I shook my head. No, sweetheart. I don't want you caught in the middle. She stood anyway. I don't care. He's my father, but you're my grandfather. And I won't let him hurt you. After she left, I sat in the garden watching the sun sink. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel completely alone. Someone still saw me. Someone still cared. But Daniel returned before Iris could confront him. He arrived one night around 10, pounding on the door. I opened it to find him tense and serious. Dad, we need to talk. He walked inside without waiting for me. He sat in the living room while I remained standing. What's going on? I asked. He exhaled sharply. Dad, Colin made me a proposal. It's good. Very good. He can insure everything in that chest, but he needs to see it, appraise it, document it. I shook my head. I already told you no. He stood abruptly. Dad, stop being so distrustful. He's trying to help you. I looked him straight in the eyes. Help me, or help you. The silence was suffocating. Daniel looked at me with something I had never seen in him before. Not anger, but contempt. You know what, old man? Do whatever you want. He turned toward the door. Before leaving, he stopped and, without looking back, said, One day you'll need me. And when that day comes, I hope you remember this. Then he left, slamming the door with a sharp, final crack. I stood there in the empty living room feeling that I hadn't just lost an argument. I had lost my son. And the truth was, he had lost me long before. I was only just accepting it. That night, I took out an old photograph of Daniel. He was 8 years old in that photo, standing beside me in the workshop with a tiny hammer in his hand, smiling as if the world belonged to him. He looked happy, innocent, entirely mine. I stared at that picture for hours and cried. Cried for the boy he once was, for the man he could have become, and for the stranger he eventually became. At some point during the night, Marjorie came downstairs and found me still sitting there with the photo resting in my hands. She didn't speak. She just sat beside me, letting her silence hold my pain, because sometimes words can't mend what is broken, sometimes only quiet company can. 3 weeks after our last fight, Daniel called. His tone was different. Soft, almost gentle. "Dad, I'm sorry. I crossed the line. I shouldn't have spoken to you that way." I said nothing. I heard the apology, but I didn't believe it. He continued, "I want to invite you to dinner in New York. This Friday. A nice place, just you and me, like before. What do you say?" A part of me, a foolish small part that refused to die, wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that maybe he wanted to return to me. Not for the chest, not for the fortune, but for something real. "All right," I finally said. "Okay, Dad. I'll pick you up at 5. He hung up, and I sat there holding the phone, praying I wasn't making a mistake. But deep down, I knew I was. Friday came. Daniel arrived in a shiny black Mercedes with leather seats and that sharp, expensive smell I had never liked. "Do you like it, Dad?" he asked. I nodded politely. "It's nice." I got in. He drove fast, talking non-stop about business deals, clients, contracts. I listened halfway, staring out the window at the fields, the hills, the towns passing by, wondering at what point I stopped recognizing this man who shared my blood. We reached New York as the sun was setting, the sky glowing orange and beautiful, but I felt a heaviness in my chest, a bad feeling I couldn't shake. The restaurant was in the heart of the city. Glass walls, golden lights, waiters dressed in black vests. "Business people come here," Daniel said proudly. "You'll like it." But I didn't. I felt painfully out of place in my old shirt, worn shoes, and slow steps. People looked at us. No, at me, wondering what an old man like me was doing there. Daniel walked ahead confidently, greeting the maitre d'. "Reservation for 6. I stopped. 6. He turned. "Yeah, Dad. I told you it was dinner. Some friends are joining us." He hadn't told me anything. Not a single word. And in that moment, I understood this was not the dinner he promised. It was something else entirely. At the table were already several people. Lucia sat scrolling through her phone. Colin Sharp sat beside her in a blue suit with that polished empty smile I already knew too well. 3 other men I'd never seen were there too. Daniel introduced me blandly. "This is my dad, Harold." The men nodded. One raised a hand slightly, another offered a thin smile. No one stood. No one shook my hand. I sat at the far end of the table. Daniel sat at the opposite side, as far from me as possible. And that's how the worst dinner of my life began. They talked about things I didn't understand. Hedge funds, stocks, real estate deals. The words were quick, cold, and coded. I tried following the conversation, but it was like listening to another language. I cut my steak slowly. It felt tough in my mouth, or maybe I just didn't have the strength to swallow anymore. No one asked me a question. No one looked at me. I was invisible, a ghost sitting quietly at the end of that long, cold table. At one point, one of the men mentioned family assets. "Everything must be legally documented," he said seriously. Colin immediately leaned forward. "Exactly. Some people keep fortunes in their houses with zero protection, no insurance. It's a massive risk." The men nodded. I felt their words aiming straight at me. Daniel glanced at me sideways. I held his gaze, and in that instant, everything clicked. This wasn't reconciliation. This was an ambush, a staged intervention to shame me in front of strangers, to paint me as a stubborn, irresponsible old man. I chose to speak only once. They were discussing antique value, and having worked with jewelry for 60 years, I wanted to contribute. Actually, the value of an antique doesn't depend only on the metal or stones. It depends on the provenance, on the history, on who. Daniel cut me off sharply, lifting his hand like he was stopping traffic. Dad, stop. You don't understand these things. Let us talk. The words caught in my throat. My fork hung in the air. My dignity cracked silently. Lucia looked away. Colin smiled awkwardly. The others continued talking as if nothing had happened, as if I had never existed at all. The rest of the dinner was a quiet sort of torture. I stopped trying to speak. I chewed without tasting. I drank water without thirst. I just waited for it to be over. Daniel laughed with the others. Lucia ordered dessert. Colin told a joke, and everyone burst out laughing except me. At one point, Daniel looked at me and asked, "Are you okay, Dad?" I nodded. I was not okay. I was shattered. And the worst part wasn't the interruption. It was that he had humiliated me in front of strangers, in front of his wife, in front of everyone. He stripped away my voice, my dignity, my place. He reduced me to nothing. When the dinner finally ended, we all walked out together. The night was cold. Daniel talked with Colin about something I couldn't care to decipher. Lucia hurried ahead without looking back. I stayed a few steps behind, watching them drift away from me like shadows. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned. A man around 60 stood there, gray beard, tired eyes. "Mr. Whitmore?" I nodded. "My name is Evan Burns. I worked with your son 5 years ago." He shook my hand firmly. "Nice to meet you." Evan leaned close and warned me in a trembling whisper to be careful, saying Daniel had ruined him the same way and that his debts were deep and dangerous. Before I could ask more, he disappeared into the crowd. When Daniel returned and asked who he was, I shrugged it off, but suspicion flickered across his face before he quietly informed me he wouldn't drive me home. He had early meetings. Another abandonment disguised as practicality. The train ride back to Vermont felt endless. I watched my reflection in the window, an old man humiliated by his own son, while the darkness swallowed town after town. When I stepped into the cold night, something inside me broke, and I cried for the first time in years, accepting the truth I had avoided. My son did not love me, and maybe he never had. The next morning I couldn't rise from bed. Marjorie knocked gently, worrying, but I lay still, drowning in the weight of everything. Eventually I forced myself up. When the phone rang, it was Justice Roberts. His voice was firm, urgent. He asked to visit in person. He arrived that afternoon carrying the same leather briefcase he'd used for decades. After Marjorie left the room, he took a steady breath and said he had delicate news. My stomach tightened as he opened his briefcase, pulling out papers he didn't yet reveal. He told me Daniel had appeared at his office unannounced, demanding something no client had ever asked for, access to my will. I felt a blow in my chest as Justice explained he refused, but Daniel insisted, saying I was old and it was time to prepare things. Then Justice told me the worst part. Daniel had reached into his wallet and offered him $5,000 in cash to betray me. Justice slammed the briefcase shut, said he threw him out, and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You deserve to know who your son has become." Justice's warning stayed with me long after he left. Each day revealed something darker, and by afternoon I couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't find a single thing that tasted like life anymore. My son had tried to bribe the lawyer, tried to access my will, and was already counting the days until I died. When Marjorie asked what Justice had said, the words felt too heavy to speak. But eventually I told her, and something inside me cracked. That night, I found an old photo of Daniel at 8 years old, smiling, holding a tiny hammer in the workshop. I stared at that innocent face for hours and cried for the boy he once was, and for the stranger he had become. Marjorie found me sitting with the picture resting in my hands. She didn't speak. She simply sat beside me, letting silence hold what words couldn't. 3 weeks later, Daniel called. His voice was soft, almost affectionate, apologizing for crossing the line and inviting me to dinner in New York, just us, like before. A small part of me wanted to believe him. I agreed, hoping I wasn't walking into another wound. On Friday, he arrived in a sleek black Mercedes, talking non-stop about business as we drove. I stared out the window, wondering when exactly the boy in that photo disappeared. When we reached the glowing city, the sunset felt wasted on my unease. The restaurant was expensive, polished, suffocating. "Reservation for 6, Daniel told the maitre d'. My chest tightened. He had told me nothing about guests. At the table sat Lucia, scrolling her phone, Colin, smiling with empty precision, and 3 unfamiliar men. Daniel introduced me flatly. "This is my dad." No one stood. No one shook my hand. Their cold nods and muttered greetings told me everything. This wasn't reconciliation. It was an ambush. I spoke only once, offering a simple note about the value of antiques, drawn from 60 years of knowledge. Daniel cut me off sharply, raising a hand like stopping traffic. "Dad, stop. You don't understand these things. Let us talk." The words cracked something inside me. Lucia looked away. Colin smirked. The rest pretended I wasn't there at all. When dinner ended, I stepped outside into the freezing night, alone in every sense. Then a hand touched my shoulder. A gray-bearded man introduced himself as Evan Burns, someone who had worked with Daniel years ago. He leaned close and whispered that Daniel had done to him exactly what he was doing to me. "Don't trust him. And trust Colin even less." Before I could speak, he disappeared into the crowd. When Daniel returned and asked who it was, I brushed it off. Suspicion flickered in his eyes before he muttered he couldn't drive me home and would drop me at the station instead. Another cut. Another quiet betrayal disguised as convenience. The train ride home felt endless. I watched my reflection in the window, a tired old man, humiliated and betrayed by the person he raised. By the time I stepped out into the cold Vermont night, tears ran down my face. Standing there in the empty street, hands in my pockets, I cried like I hadn't cried in years. Because that night, something settled inside me with brutal clarity. My son did not love me. Maybe he never had. The next morning, I didn't leave bed until noon. Marjorie kept knocking. "Mr. Whitmore, are you all right?" I didn't answer. I stared at the ceiling, the weight of humiliation still pressing on my chest. When I finally dragged myself downstairs, the phone rang. It was Justice Roberts, the family lawyer. Serious, correct, dependable. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to speak with you. It's urgent." "Tell me, Justice." "I'd rather say it in person." "May I come this afternoon?" "Of course." He arrived with his old leather briefcase. We sat in the living room. Marjorie brought coffee. When she left, he took a deep breath. "Mr. Whitmore, what I'm about to tell you is very delicate." "Tell me," I said. Justice opened his briefcase, hesitating before he spoke. He told me Daniel had shown up at his office unannounced, asking for something no client had ever demanded in 40 years. My pulse tightened as I asked what it was, and Justice looked me straight in the eye. "He asked to see your will." The words hit like a blow. He continued quietly, explaining he'd refused, but Daniel insisted, saying I was old and it was time to prepare things. Then Justice told me the part that froze my blood. Daniel had pulled out his wallet and offered him $5,000 to betray me. Justice slammed the briefcase shut and said he threw him out. As he left, he warned me to be careful, because the man he saw in that office was not the boy he once knew. I stood at the window, feeling something dark coil inside me. My son had tried to bribe my lawyer. My son was already counting the days until I died. When Marjorie came in, I could barely speak the truth out loud. After she left, something inside me finally cracked. I went to Richard's old room and found an old drawing of the 3 of us under a yellow sun. I stared at it until I realized the child in that picture no longer existed. Maybe he never had. I tore it into pieces and let them fall like dead leaves. At 3 a.m, I sat at the kitchen table asking myself what came next. Reporting him without proof would let him twist the truth. Confronting him would only bring lies. Waiting would make me a victim. I refused to be a victim. The fog lifted, sharp and cold. I opened an old notebook, wrote the word plan, and outlined 6 steps: replicas, removal, bait, theft, exposure, destruction. This was no longer about forgiveness. This was about teaching. And the best lessons cut the deepest. Daniel stopped being my son the day he chose gold over me. The day he chose greed over love. And I finally understood that the boy I loved had died long ago. At 5 in the morning, I made one final decision. I would give him one last chance. One last moment to prove me wrong. I would call him and tell him everything. Raw, unfiltered truth. If he chose the same path afterward, then I would execute the plan without hesitation, without remorse, without guilt. I picked up the phone. Dialed his number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Dad, what happened?" "It's 5 in the morning." His voice sounded annoyed. I breathed deeply. "Daniel, I need to talk to you. It's important." A short silence. "Dad, I can't right now. I'm sleeping. Call me later." And he hung up. Just like that. No concern, no worry, no question. That click on the line was the clearest truth of my life. I dialed again. He didn't answer. I dialed again. Voicemail. When I told Daniel the chest would never be his, "Not now, not ever," he said nothing. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. He didn't call back. He didn't defend himself. He simply revealed who he had become, and with that, he chose his path. Now it was my turn to choose mine. Marjorie found me in the workshop at dawn, the notebook open, my eyes hollow from a night without sleep. When she asked what I planned to do, I told her the truth. I would give him enough rope to hang himself. I would let him condemn himself publicly, undeniably, and I would no longer shield him from the consequences he had earned. She took my hand and told me she was with me until the end. Then Iris arrived. She read the plan, tears filling her eyes as she whispered that the repercussions would destroy him. I nodded because I knew. She surprised me by saying she would help. When I warned her this might cost me my son forever, she held my gaze and said something I had avoided admitting for years. "Grandpa, you lost him long ago. You're only closing the door now." That afternoon, before meeting Elijah, I opened the chest and removed every real jewel, pieces crafted by 3 generations of honest hands. I looked at them gently, telling them they would help me teach the final lesson. When I closed the empty chest, something inside me closed too. Hope. Illusion. The last threads of unconditional love. I wrote a letter and hid it beneath the fake bars. Maybe Daniel would read it, maybe not, but he needed to know I had seen everything long before he made his move. That night, Iris flew to Switzerland with the real jewels. When she left, the house fell painfully quiet. Marjorie and I stood over the hollow chest, knowing the storm ahead had already begun. When Marjorie asked what came next, I told her we wait, because Daniel's next move would lead him straight into the trap he thought he was setting for me. That night, I slept better than I had in months. I was no longer a helpless old man waiting for a blow. I was a father preparing the hardest lesson his son would ever face. The morning sun rose over the hills, and for the first time in a long while, I felt hope, not for Daniel, but for myself. I had not lost my dignity, and I would not let anyone steal it, not even my own son. 4 days passed after sealing the chest. Silence. No calls, no visits, just the slow tension of waiting. I carried on with my routine, breakfast with Marjorie, hours in the workshop, afternoons in the garden, yet everything felt sharper, heavier. Disaster wasn't looming anymore. It was approaching on schedule. Each night, Iris called from Switzerland to confirm everything was safe, the jewels locked away, the foundation registered, the documents filed. I thanked her, knowing the final test was coming. And waiting became its own battle. On the 5th day, Daniel finally arrived. He came alone, no Lucia, no accomplices, no arrogance. Marjorie opened the door and slipped away, leaving us in the heavy silence of the living room. For a moment, he looked almost like the boy I used to know. "Hi, Dad," he said softly. "Hello, Daniel," I answered. We sat. And for one fragile heartbeat, something flickered inside me, hope trying to rise from the grave. Daniel spoke quietly, eyes on the floor. He talked about the distance between us, about the things he'd said, about regret. And when he whispered, "I'm sorry," something deep within me shifted, like an old wound remembering pain. I tried to respond, but he lifted his hand. "Let me finish," he said. And I braced myself, knowing that whatever came next would decide everything. I wanted to believe him, God knows I did, but sincerity vanished the moment he spoke about help. It wasn't an apology or a son trying to come home. It was a proposal disguised as concern, delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who had already rehearsed the pitch. He talked fast about security, insurance, armored facilities, and how all I had to do was sign. I watched him the way one watches a stranger pretending to be family, his words dripping with false warmth as he nudged me toward the edge of my own betrayal. When he finished, the silence felt heavier than his lies. He waited for resistance, for anger, for the father he thought he could outplay. But instead, I gave him the line he least expected. I told him he was right, that I was old, that he should take charge. His eyes lit up with a greed he tried to mask as gratitude, and when he hugged me, all I felt was the cold weight of the deal he thought he had already won. After he left, Marjorie stepped out, her voice trembling as she asked what came next. I told her the truth. We wait. Because when he opened that chest and found the replicas, he would finally understand the price of the legacy he chose to destroy. That night, his allies called, their voices bright and confident as they planned the theft as casually as planning a dinner. The papers arrived the next day, legal traps wrapped in polite wording, and I saw how thoroughly they intended to erase me. I called Justice Roberts, who warned me not to sign, but I had already accepted the path ahead. I signed anyway. And when I placed the envelope on the hall table, I knew the real confrontation hadn't begun yet. It was waiting just beyond Friday. That night, sleep never came. I sat in the dark living room, listening to the house creak around me as the clock crawled toward dawn. Friday would end everything. Daniel would take the chest, believing he had finally outsmarted me. But this wasn't a battle of strength. It was a test of intelligence, and my final move was already in play. Before sunrise, I walked to the back room and rested my hand on the cold chest. "Tomorrow, son," I whispered. "Tomorrow you'll learn who your father truly is." The morning arrived gray and sharp. Marjorie moved quietly in the kitchen, her eyes filled with fear. When she offered to stay, I told her to leave. She hugged me as if she feared she might never see me standing again. At 9, Daniel called. "We'll be there by noon." I sat in the garden, remembering Eleanor's warning, don't give everything to him. Teach him to deserve it. Today, that lesson would finally find him. Exactly at noon, a white industrial van pulled up. Daniel, Colin, and, unexpectedly, Lucia stepped out, their faces tight with excitement. They entered like owners, Colin holding the documents I'd already signed, believing they sealed his victory. I showed them the back room. Daniel squeezed my shoulder, thanking me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They lifted the chest, carried it through the house, and loaded it into the van with the urgency of people stealing something valuable. 15 minutes later, the doors slammed shut. Daniel hugged me, promising updates. Lucia kissed my cheek. Colin shook my hand. Then they drove away with the replicas and their own downfall. When I turned, I found Marjorie sobbing upstairs, having witnessed everything. I held her until she calmed. "It's over," I said. "How can you be calm?" "Because the punishment has already begun." That afternoon, I called Justice Roberts. "File it," I said. "Not as theft. Mark it as family betrayal." Justice hesitated, warning it would be painful, but I told him it had to be done. If I stayed silent, Daniel would go on believing he could steal, and that ended now. Justice exhaled, promised to file in the morning, and that night I sat in the dark, knowing my son was somewhere preparing to sell what he thought was my fortune, never suspecting the real trap was hidden in the chest. On Saturday, Justice filed the case with the district attorney. The charges were grand larceny, elder abuse, fraud. The report named Daniel as the man who stole a multimillion-dollar chest from his elderly father. By Sunday, the story was everywhere, and my phone rang, but I ignored every voice. I was waiting for his. On Monday, Daniel finally called, shaking as he insisted he had only been helping me, that the chest was safe, begging me to deny what the world believed. I listened until his excuses ran dry, then told him quietly to open the chest and call me back. When I hung up, I felt no joy, only the certainty that once he lifted that lid, something in him would break. Days of silence followed. Then justice called again. Police had arrested Daniel, his wife, and Colin at a European diamond market after they carried the chest into an appraisal house. An old expert examined the treasure and calmly declared every bar and stone fake, brass plated as gold, glass posing as gems, until their fortune crumbled into scraps. Daniel finally snapped, screaming that his father had tricked him, and in his panic he told them everything. But it was too late. For days, the world had been reading about the greedy son and the old jeweler who outsmarted him, and the moment Daniel thought he was walking into a sale, he stepped into a courtroom of eyes. He didn't argue. He simply stepped back and called the police, and within minutes patrol cars surrounded the building. Daniel tried to run, Colin followed, but neither made it past the doorway. They were handcuffed and treated exactly as what they had chosen to become, criminals. As justice described it all, a cold, steady sense of justice settled over me, sharper than anything I had felt in months. But justice wasn't finished. At the station, Lucia broke. She screamed at Daniel in front of officers, furious that the millions he promised her had turned into worthless replicas. When she shouted that she had only married him for the inheritance, I felt a truth I had long suspected snap into place. Later, she begged the consulate for protection, claimed she was an innocent victim, and with no evidence against her, she was released. She took the first flight not home to him, but to her mother's house. Daniel collapsed when he learned she was gone. Guards said he cried like a child, repeating, "I lost everything." I didn't pity him. He was finally meeting the consequences he had earned. Steve, meanwhile, tried to save himself by blaming Daniel entirely, lying through his teeth until the police pulled his record, 3 prior scams. He was extradited with Daniel, but never spoke to him on the flight. And Daniel, chained beside him, finally understood what true loneliness felt like. The story exploded everywhere: articles, broadcasts, headlines calling him the son who stole fake gold and exposed his own greed. Praise and criticism poured in, but none of it mattered. The truth had surfaced. 3 days later, a journalist named Bridget Solano arrived at my estate, asking why I had chosen this path. I told her the truth. I needed Daniel to condemn himself. Without the chest in his hands, he would have called me paranoid. But with it, he wrote his own downfall. I allowed myself a small smile and told Bridget that I had friends, old friends, who still believed in justice. Then she asked the one question that cut deeper than the rest. Did I feel guilt? Did it feel like betraying my son? I breathed slowly before answering. I hadn't betrayed him. He had betrayed me long ago. All I had done was teach him the lesson I should have taught earlier, that actions carry consequences, and you cannot steal from your father and expect the world to stay silent. Gold can be replaced. Dignity cannot. She asked if I would ever forgive him. I looked at the horizon and said I had forgiven him long before this, but forgiveness doesn't erase accountability. He still had to face what he chose. The interview ran on Sunday, front page, unchanged. The headline struck the world like a hammer. Dignity cannot be stolen. Suddenly, everything shifted. Neighbors who never cared approached me with admiration. Strangers thanked me for my courage. I didn't feel brave, only weary, but I felt something return inside me. I had reclaimed my name. A week later, I summoned the press. Cameras filled the hall as Iris held my arm. I spoke clearly, revealing that Richard had never stolen real gold at all. The true jewels were in Switzerland, locked in a safety deposit box under a foundation I created for Helen. Its mission was to save struggling family jewelry businesses, support artisans, and train young people, because legacy is not meant to be hoarded. It is meant to be passed on. The room rose in applause. Iris cried quietly. I walked out knowing Helen would have been proud. In the weeks that followed, invitations poured in, but for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. 3 months later, Richard was sentenced to probation, therapy, community service, and a restraining order. Steve received prison time. Camila vanished. Even Evan Burns called, saying the words I had waited to hear. Justice was done. 6 months passed in complete silence. Richard didn't call or write. I continued my life. I worked in the workshop. Iris visited often. The foundation grew. We helped 5 jewelry stores recover and gave scholarships to 10 young apprentices. Helen's name appeared on every plaque, on every letter, and it felt like she was still here somehow. One Saturday, while pruning roses in the garden, I heard a taxi stop at the gate. Richard stepped out. He looked thin, pale, and worn down, with messy hair and simple clothes. All trace of arrogance was gone. He walked toward me slowly. I set down the shears and waited. He stopped a few feet away. We stared at each other in a silence filled with everything that had happened. "Dad," he said softly. I didn't answer. He took another step, his voice shaking. "Dad, I came to ask for forgiveness." And then, to my disbelief, he knelt right there in the damp garden soil. He knelt like a broken man. "Forgive me, Dad. I was wrong. I lost everything. Camila, my friends, my reputation, my dignity. Everything." I looked at him from above, not with hate, not with love either, but with a deep sadness only a father can feel when he sees his child destroyed. "Dad, please say something. Scream at me, hit me, just don't look at me like that." I crouched down so we were at the same level. I looked him in the eyes. "Son, I forgave you long before you stole the chest. I forgave you the moment I knew what you were planning." He sobbed. "Then do you forgive me?" I nodded slowly. "I forgive you. But there is something I cannot return to you." He looked confused. "What, Dad?" I placed my hand on his shoulder. "Your name. The one you lost on your own." His eyes closed, and I knew he understood. "When people hear your name, Richard, they will remember what you did. The betrayal, the greed, the theft. I cannot erase that. Only you can." He cried harder. "How do I fix it, Dad? How do I get it back?" I stood, offered him my hand, and pulled him up. "Don't ask me to fix it for you. Fix yourself. Forgive who you were. Start building who you should have been. Work, help, do good. And maybe one day, when people hear your name, they will think of something worthy. But I won't be the one to guide you through that. This part, son, you must walk alone." Richard hugged me tightly, desperately, like the frightened boy he once was, and for the first time in years, I let him. I let him hold on to me, but I couldn't bring myself to return the embrace because something inside me had already cracked beyond repair. When he stepped back and wiped his face, he whispered a thanks, for the lesson, and for not abandoning him completely. I only nodded and told him to take care. He walked toward the taxi, then paused with his hand on the door. He asked if I would ever be able to look at him the way I once did, and I answered honestly that I didn't know. He accepted it silently, got in, and disappeared down the road while I stood in the garden feeling, for the first time, not pain but relief. I had finally spoken the truth that had been suffocating me for years. A few weeks passed before Iris visited again, this time with her little boy, my great-grandson, Matthew. He came running toward me with tiny steps and bright eyes, calling my name in his own clumsy way. I lifted him into my arms, and in that moment something warm and familiar returned to me. Iris smiled softly, telling me how pure he was, and I agreed. I told her that when he grew old enough to understand, I would teach him that real gold isn't something you lock away, but something you give freely. Money can vanish, fortunes can disappear, but dignity, if you guard it, remains. She hugged me, and the three of us stayed there in the sunlight, a new generation beginning where another had fallen apart. And you? Have you ever put your trust in someone who later betrayed you? Did you confront it, or did you stay silent hoping time would wash the wound away? Sometimes the deepest pain comes from the people we love most, but that pain reveals who we are, what we refuse to tolerate, and what we must protect. Because in the end, dignity is the only treasure we truly own.